If you're ready, David, I'm ready to dig in.
Yeah.
Awesome. So welcome everyone to our Fireside with David Buckmaster. Um, just so you know, I stated this a little bit earlier on the call, but if you want to ask any questions for this Fireside, you can put them into the channel where you're able to chat, or we recommend put them in the QA if you can find that. And then that will create a list for David and I to go through at the end of the call. We'll make sure to get through as many questions as we can. For this call, it is recorded. We will be sharing it later. So don't worry if you have to drop off early or if anything comes up. We will send this out to you and you'll be able to enjoy the full conversation. And as a little bit of an intro just on myself, I'm not this focus here, but I am Kaitlyn, one of the founders at Pequity. We are focused on catching comp problems where they happen. So compensation being a key interest of mine. We saw that David, who is a director of compensation at Nike, wrote a book called Fair Pay. It's actually a very long title, How to Get a Raise. And I have to read the whole thing here.
Right here. It just came in last week, so I'm very excited to show it off. Actually.
Oh, look at that. Real copy. I haven't got mine yet, but I pre-ordered it, so I'm very excited.
Thank you very much.
But we're really excited to get to talk with him because he has a lot of insight and some really interesting takes on compensation and how to pay equitably and how to manage your comp programs better. So David, I mean, I'd love if you could just give a little intro on yourself, your background in comp, and just share some notes with the team here before we kick off in the full conversation.
Sure. All right. Well, let me just start by saying thank you to everybody who has joined in, not just for the Pequity team for having me, but for the people who are on, who signed up. Like, I was blown away looking at this list, so that you all would spend this much time with me. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And let me also say, I'm here today. Yes, I work for Nike. I'm not here as a Nike spokesperson today. What I can do is, if you want to talk shop, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. We can connect and have the conversations that way. But my background is, like many of you in the comp world, I have worked, started in the nonprofit space and then went to Starbucks headquarters where I ran retail pay for them. That was in Seattle, moved down to Texas and led international comp for Yum Brands, which is KFC, Pizza, and Taco Bell. They've added a burger chain since, but I wasn't there for that. So I led international pay for them. And then now I'm back in the Northwest at Nike. I was in a more broad-based role for the majority of my time there. I'm coming up in 4 years and I've just moved into kind of my sweet spot, which is retail pay. So that's where I get most passionate about. You might hear a lot of connections back into that world today.
Awesome. Well, all that you listed there, you know, it's interesting because it's a lot of numbers and sheets and logic, and it's all the things that we comp people kind of live in. So, you know, how did you decide to write this book? What motivated you?
It's a little strange, right? Because most of us, we just spend most of our time in Excel spreadsheets. Like, writing a book is not, like, you know, part of the normal habit of comp people. I will say that, like, I grew up writing. Writing is an important part of my life, something I've always done. Like, if you're a good internet sleuth, you can probably find old things that I've written on McSweeney's or whatever it may be. I was in my previous job and things were going really well. Loved my team. Super burned out, right? And, you know, I think there's just a bunch of things happening at once where I felt like I needed to find some sense of myself again. And at the same time, we were living in a location that was just not super conducive to our family life, right? We just weren't happy where we were living, wanted to get back to the Northwest. And I think everybody knows when your family's not happy, like, everything kind of falls from there, right? So I started writing again. It didn't really matter what I was writing. I just needed to write. But, you know, one of the things that when you're writing that most people will say is just, like, write what you know, write what you want to exist in the world, right? So I know comp, I know there's a bunch of things that I just think need to exist, right? We need to be talking about this in a much different way. So I submitted an essay to something called the Brackenbauer Prize, which is put on by the Financial Times and McKinsey & Company. It's just an essay contest. And I was really excited to be shortlisted globally for that. And, you know, so there's a contest there. I didn't win the contest, but it was kind of enough credibility for me to do the standard, like, let me look in the back of the book and find a bunch of agents' names, see if anybody will take me seriously. Fortunately, they did. And so I ended up signing with an agency in New York, and then that led to a book with HarperCollins on their Harper Business imprint. And a few years later, here we are. So very, very like non-traditional and like the things coming together, but also like kind of a traditional path to writing a book.
I mean, that's inspirational. It shows we can be multifaceted people as comp analysts. And the book has quite a focus. We're looking at fair pay, and even that word
Yeah.
fair as comp people, it's such a triggering word sometimes. So would love to know, it states kind of what the goal is, but what as the writer really was your goal for the book?
Yeah, so I think I really want to redeem that word. So I chose fair because I mean it is provocative, and I think we carry all sorts of baggage into that word, whether it's our own employment experiences or even like political language, whatever you want to on top of that. But I think broadly, this word fair is just like saying, am I getting paid enough, right? And I think that breaks out into two categories. One is in absolute terms, am I paid enough, to cover my essentials, to that are commensurate with my skills and experience. But then there's also like the relative. Am I getting paid in relative terms in an equitable way, similar to somebody who's with similar experience, similar skill, contributing similar value, right? So those are the two questions that I think when you're a comp pro, you kind of have enough data to answer those questions most of the time. But I think we all know that we operate in a very tight black box of a field. And so most people don't get that opportunity, right? So the intent of using the word fair pay is, I think it's just this catch-all word that we just have to get more comfortable using. And I've been really interested to like I've obviously started noticing this a lot more, but like, I'll see the big survey vendors start to use the word fair, in the same way that I'll see if I'm reading, an article in the New York Times or whatever, and they say fair. They might have very different starting places, but like this word is something we shouldn't really be afraid of. And so that's why I wanted to try and redeem it if I could.
I mean, I love it personally. The mission with Pequity is equal pay and opportunity for all. So I feel you. We try to use the word fair as much as possible, even though it goes against everything in my comp upbringing, because obviously fair can be so subjective. But something that you said that really resonates is this idea of people just want to feel like they're being compensated equitably. I want to know if I'm doing the same work as someone else, that their pay is kind of on par with mine. And that's, it's really personal. It's something that companies struggle with. I think that equitable pay gets to the forefront of a lot of newspapers because it has that incendiary effect on our emotions. And so would love to know a little bit more from your perspective on that aspect. Like how do people who are now in this remote world being tossed into flexible work and all these different things, what's your take on compensation and the fairness side of that?
Yeah, so I think it's pay scale. They have this stat that's like, it says 1 in 5 people think that they're paid fairly. And again, fair is this word that we can attach all sorts of things to. And they asked us a follow-up question that's like, okay, if you are a manager, if you're a company, do you think you're paying your people fairly? And that answer was like 2 in 5. So like we wouldn't accept this kind of result if we're talking about our customers. If we said only 1 in 5 of our customers thinks that we treated them fairly, we would do what we could to figure that out. And so a big part of the reason for the book is to try and help change that narrative a bit, to say, hey, like if you all think that we are like going to be able to continue in this field and contain in that black box, like that's just not going to happen, right? Like we see big companies, I know you've worked for some, where there are, they'll go create their own salary spreadsheets and just ship them, right? Or there are user submitted sites that I know as comp people we have questions about, right? But like the world is going to be more transparent in our field, and we have to be ready for that because when we whether we're forced to on a legislative basis or we just collectively feel that we need to change the market and how we operate, like there's no kind of getting around. Like the way comp has always been done is not going to be the way that comp is going to be expected of us in the future. So I think companies have to be really serious about closing the delta between what they say they believe in, what they're actually doing. Because I think that world where you can have two fundamentally different takes are like, it's just going to close. I think one of your questions was around remote work, and I think this one is, and I saw it in the chat here also. The remote work thing I think is going to be super interesting, right? Because if you are in a professional job, like a lot of us, looking at the guest list, a lot of us work for tech companies or big established players, whatever it may be, our ability to work remote is a lot higher than most people.
Mhm.
Most jobs can't be remote. Like if you cut hair, you work in a restaurant, you're a nurse, you're a doctor, whatever. Like that's, well, maybe not a nurse or a doctor. I think there's some interesting telehealth stuff, but
Yeah.
but like a lot of jobs just can't be remote, so like their world is not necessarily going to pay to change any different. But like what we're seeing now is like most companies, or not most, but a lot of companies are moving to this, like, well, 1 to 3 days a week you can be, on campus versus at home. So you have some flexibility, which is super important for, people to fit their, their family needs and, just their work styles and all of that together. I think what that is saying though is that like you're still going to be tethered to your city to an extent, most of
Mhm.
us, right? Like if you have to be in the office a couple of days a week, like you're not going to take Zoom calls from the surf breaks of Portugal. Like you're not moving, for the most part. Like you have to figure that out. So like I'm wondering if, a year from now we get through this and we don't start seeing a bunch of articles that are, like we were promised flying cars, but for remote work. I think it's definitely going to happen, but it's not going to be like this mass scale revolution that I think most people are maybe hyping a bit. So I think there are fallout of that for comp, but I think it's a matter of, do we take this moment to say, okay, do we just get a lot more simple in how we operate our geographic differentials,
Yeah.
make the decision about who can work remote and who can't. I think these are really complex questions that are going to be different. The answers will be different for every company.
Mhm.
But yeah, I'm fascinated to see where we go, and I don't really have any answers on this, but I know if I'm ever looking for a job again, I'll want to have one that's open to remote work, right? So I think having that option is super interesting.
No, I love that too. And I think this goes back to a little bit of kind of what we're getting on the topic of the defining equitable and fair pay. I think it's
Mhm.
very difficult to define what is equitable. We do these pay equity tests, and you pull in gender and race, and those are the baselines, right? And then you start to pull in things like tenure and education, and it gets really complex really quickly when we think about it. And I would love to know from your perspective, just how are you defining it in your book? And is there any tidbits that you've written in there that you think will particularly help practitioners or be maybe extremely like conversation starters, we'll call them?
I'm sorry. Do you mean around gender inequity? Is that kind of the root of the question?
Yeah, just pay equity in general. I'll keep it a little
Yeah.
broad.
Okay. Okay. I think this is one of those things where, again, we have to start with definitions, right? I think
Yeah.
most companies, like if you're especially working in big companies, like we have to be really clear about what we mean when we're trying to solve this. I think there's we can say, well, there's 98 cents on the dollar or whatever on a pay equity basis, which if you do this work, that is controlling for a long list of variables, right? Where you're located, the job level you're in, all of that kind of stuff. Then there's like gender wage gap, which is usually a lot wider. It's 81 cents on the dollar or something. I think it is our role to try and help people understand these differences in definitions, because what happens, I think, too often is people will just conflate them and then assume no one really knows what's going on with gender pay equity, right? Like I hear that there's actually no problem, then I hear that there's a 20-30 cent gap, right? So we have to be really clear, what do we mean by those things? Pay equity is really just how is the company living into its own policies? Like they're saying these are our policies on promotion rates and pay ranges and annual increases or whatever it is. And so how are we making sure that we are applying our own policies fairly, right? And then pay equity pay gaps, that's just a lot more existential than that. I think if you're on the comp team, if you say, well, we can set all the right processes in the world, but like a raw wage gap, just for example, divided men by women and their average pay, like it'll be a lot wider. But as a comp person, there's not much you can do about that because you can't control who's in the jobs, right? So we need to be stepping back and saying, okay, comp is like not necessarily the canary in the coal mine saying that you've got a problem ahead. It's like the black lung disease that you get after years of bad practices, right? So it's like if you don't think through your talent acquisition strategies, your promotion practices, and all of it, you don't have good representation, of course your raw pay gap numbers are going to look terrible, right?
Mhm.
So like you have to be thinking about this on a very integrated point of view from not just total rewards or comp, but from the entire HR process. And there's even like, I mean, there's a lot like systematically, societally that has to get solved in this too,
Oh, yeah.
right? I think you and I were talking about this I think last week, right, around, there was, when minimum wage laws were first passed in the US, there was, whole industries that were totally excluded from it, right? Those
Yep.
industries happen to be populated by underrepresented groups, right? And so now, naturally, you start to see some of this separation in restaurants, hotels, whatever it may be. Civil Rights Act passed in 1967. You close that loophole. They're now eligible for minimum wage law. There's studies that say something like 20% of that raw wage gap disappeared because of that one legislative change.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So it's just, there's so much in our own world that we can control from a company point of view, but we also have to understand how everything integrates together. And these are like super hard problems, right? But for us, it starts with, let's be really clear about what we're trying to solve and making sure people understand what the definitions are, and make it really, really crisp about the rest of our talent practices.
And I love that because a lot of the focus that I've done when I've gone in and practice comp, at these companies or consulted on it, is defining. Like most of our work is spent, let's define what it means. What is the role? What does that role mean? Is it a level? Is it a certain expectation? Will multiple people be doing similar work? And sometimes it's, I think a lot of companies do a good job at that definition, but it's only internal. And to your point on transparency, it's this new age, I feel like, of sharing more of that with employees and managers and making them their own little mini comp analysts is what we see as a trend. Because it is what you have to get to, because people at the end of the day aren't going to trust the black boxy team in the corner. They're like, I want you to put it in front of me and I want to digest it. And we're at this, especially in tech, we got a lot of really smart people who can probably figure it out.
And I think that's true. But there are also things that we can do to decomplexify, it's not a word, but make it simple is the word I'm looking for, to make things easier for people to understand, and it's everything from, okay, here's our leveling guide, but let's not put a bunch of super weird titles that don't mean anything against it, right? If I'm creative at whatever company, as a comp person, what does that really mean? If I'm head of, that could be anything from, a manager to a director to whatever, right? That's kind of all over the place, right? So we have to help people be able to navigate, here's what we mean by our levels. Here's what we mean by the criteria that goes against it. Here's how we calibrate talent against those things. So we're making sure every part of our organization is using them in the same ways. And then here are some of the things that we don't do to make sure people don't get confused. I think complexity always favors those that are in power. And it is our job to make things simpler so people understand where they fit in and then what their career path looks like from there.
Well, and this is a nice segue to a bit of a pointed question. Your book lays out a lot of suggestions, I would say. And so I would love to ask you, David, how do you think we solve this wage gap?
So I think I hope my answer isn't demoralizing, but I'm not sure that you actually do solve it entirely. I think the mindset has to be, this is something that we have to be aware of and continue to monitor and either pay for certain gaps or adjust over and over again. I think Mark Benioff, the CEO at Salesforce, has in his book Trailblazer, he's got this whole thing about where he's kind of bringing his own knowledge up to speed on how this works. And he's like, well, I want to do the right thing around this. I want to make sure that I'm closing the pay equity gaps in my company. We spent, I think he said, $3 million in his book to go close it for the first year. And then he was kind of flabbergasted to say, well, the next year we had to spend $3 more million. I didn't fix the problem. And so it's like, well, what happened? It's like, well, that's a company that does a lot of acquisitions, orgs happen all the time, right? People move around, new talent comes in. So there has to be some ingrained annual process combined with some, I don't know whether it's business funds, central funds, the right internal structure to make sure this stays on the agenda. It's not a one-off event and you don't just solve it within the company. I more societally, I think there's much bigger questions that I can only guess at, right? I think one of those things is if you are a leader, think about who you're calling, when you have a problem, right? Are you, and who you're putting on big projects? Are you just calling the single guy because that they've got nothing else going on and they can do it, but you're not calling the recent mom to help with the project? Are you setting expectations in a way that gives more opportunity to one person than the other because you haven't really thought through the ramifications of that, right? So you have to think through just all of those things within your own company. But the society thing is, if I had a good answer for that, I probably wouldn't be on a comp team, right?
You'd have a couple more books, I think.
Maybe so, yeah.
No, and I love the way that you call it out, because it's definitely, we formed Pequity's platform because I felt the same thing. It's not you can't step in one time and it's going to solve it. You need a system that checks you every step away. And some companies do this usually by, duct tape and bubble gum between spreadsheets and emails and Slack channels and mini automations, but it's not scalable for a lot of them. So we focus in on that, and it brings in, I think the most interesting thing about what I've seen with our customers is the data. Like, we all have market data and we use it, and you have to start with, I would say, really good market data. And we know the big players that are out there, and we always recommend them for our Pequity customers. But the data that you also get internally can be just incredibly valuable. And, something that I think about with data, I know we talked about before, is the reliance that we have on market data, which is good because it means we're all kind of working from the same book. But the way that people interpret it can also be a little damaging when it comes to the pay equity conversation. So I'd love, picking up on a previous conversation, but if you want to share some thoughts there.
So I think most companies, when they start to look at the data, you start to see certain patterns over time, right? And I think companies that are really thoughtful about this will put the market data in its place sometimes to say, okay, this is what the data says, but is this necessarily the right thing for my company? Like, how is this going to show up? And that might mean that some roles are elevated ahead of where the market is, and some you just kind of let stagnate for a while, right? I think this is especially true on low wage work, where if you're thinking about kind of having your survey data as one lens of many to say, what are our culture and values, what do our employees say, what do our managers say, what's expected of us, and honestly, even in like news media, right, for low wage pay, like there's no way that you can cut traditional survey data that is going to tell you right now that $15 an hour is the market rate. I don't care which survey you go, it's not going to be there, right? Like, that's not the national retail rate. The companies that have done it because their CEOs have stood up and said, we are basically going to say, we understand the market, but we're going to do something different, right? So there's something that's more, there's market-based comp and there's values-based comp also. So those things have to be not necessarily in tension, but in harmony, actually, to make sure that you are kind of living into your values. If you're, I think all companies like to say they're value-driven companies, right? But like, if that's something that you really want to show up in the right ways for, you have to know when you kind of toggle on and off that market data, when to either let it drive the decisions you're making, or if you are letting it, be one factor among many. I think I even wrote in the book, like, for some people that are listening, like, this might be the most controversial section of the entire book, right? Because I think there's also this mentality of, well, we're going to be super objective, and whatever the market data says, that's it. I don't care. Your rate's going up, it's going down. I think when you look at this data, especially across multiple countries, for too long, you start to say, well, maybe a little more volatile than we want it to be. Maybe we don't want the employee experience to be that volatile either. So think about the assumptions about what goes into the data, what you're getting out of it, and then what the actual effect on your employees are, and will they perceive that as being fair anymore, right? So again, market data will always be important to us, especially the kind of the third-party vendors and surveys that we know can get too big advantages maybe over some of the more user-submitted stuff, where it's normalized across levels, hopefully, and it's full census data, right? Where you get the entire stack, not just people who are either so happy or so upset that they went and filled out a online template. So but let me just say, like, I think our field is fundamentally changing in this regard also. And so we need to be open to, the different kinds of input sources, because we know that, the average, marketing person or accountant or whatever, they don't have access to our data. So the only thing they can do is go Google, accounting manager salary, Portland, Oregon, and then they're going to show that to you. And if our answer takes 20 minutes to explain, we have to be better than that, So like that's where I think a lot of the opportunities are for us.
Couldn't agree more. Being able to, I always put the challenge to my team of, we want to enable managers to never have to go in a room and look someone in the eye and not be able to say why they're paid what they're paid, right? Like, that's the worst.
Right.
And it takes simplification, as you mentioned, which I want to highlight, and also the education. And I think, to your point, like, you need to have a system or some process in place for your team that you feel that you can not have your finger on every offer. I remember the day that we I hired my first analyst on one of my old teams, and I didn't have to touch every offer, and I could train her and then just get reports out. And I was like, wow, like the magic,
Yeah.
but you have to do that at scale. And that is terrifying stuff.
Yeah. And, I think it's incredibly hard. Just like the nature of what we do is, I think there's some inherent distrust in it anyway, right? Because again, if it's a one-way transaction where the only people who have access to the data, like, you're starting from a hole to some extent, and like comp is one of those things that, as you said, is so deeply personal. Like, you owe it to the person to have empathy and to hear them out and understand that they're not coming at this with the same level of material that you are, and I think this is the like one of the hardest parts about our field, and that, like, nobody's ever happy about what they get paid, right? I mean, it doesn't matter where you are on the salary range. Like, you always think, I should be making like 10% more or whatever it is. It just doesn't matter, right? But like, you don't see this in other parts of the organization. Like, you don't see like the like the accountants go over to your like marketing folks or whatever and say, I did some internet research and I think our brand architecture is wrong. Here's what I think we should do. But like, everybody's got this opinion on comp, because they Google some stuff or whatever. And so again, like, we just have to be able to design programs that, are people relevant, are market relevant, obviously, and something that we can help people understand in a way that is cohesive, brings clarity, and ultimately like relieves the anxiety about the pay conversation. So they understand that it's fair, they understand that they're paid enough, and enough is a kind of a loaded word. It implies kind of a cap, right? But what I mean by that is that they are paid appropriately for their role, and that they have, they can grow a big career at that particular company. And that's really all we're here to enable, right? Is to attract and retain and motivate people, right, to stay.
No, exactly. And that segues nice. I know we have some questions coming in, so I think we can probably open up some QA, because some of them are very topical to the conversation. And one that kind of goes into this data point, and I have my own thoughts too, so I really want to hear what yours are, David, which is, how do you get other leaders and eventually employees on board with benchmark data and to feel that the market data is valid?
See, Zach, if you come up with an answer, please let me know on that one. But that's always we think it's valid if we think the number is high enough, right? Like you only normally hear the you don't normally hear the, well, that's super valid if it's lower than they expected it to be. So I think that there's something around being able to set expectations appropriately. And I think if you say, well, I think the traditional approach is like, let's start with a peer group or whatever that we think is relevant to us, compared to the overall survey. What kind of difference do we see? And then help them understand what all goes into it. It's like a couple of things that I've mentioned already around, hey, like, this is what everybody in the industry agrees is not to keep picking on accountants, but a P2 accountant, right? Like, we've all kind of agreed to the same set of criteria. And these are, kind of normalized, right? So there's third parties to look at this, and I don't know if there's a better way of doing it, honestly. So how do you get other leaders on board with it? This goes into this fundamental question where everybody kind of thinks they're better than the normal distribution curve, right? They think they're higher on it, and I think that's true for us too, right? But I think if people understand the process, they can usually understand the the results of that process, even if they don't necessarily even if they think the number should be higher. But it's a tough question for sure.
Yeah. It goes, why do you think managers are as defined comp?
Oh, define what comp data we present. I don't know.
Oh, I mean, it goes, I feel like I'm gonna hop in on that a little. Something I've noticed, and maybe other people would feel similar. There's some companies out there that I've been curious about, where I've heard, oh, we have great comp scores, like our comp happiness is high. And I'd be like, what are you doing? And the interesting take that I have on it is that they usually are the ones that aren't paying top of market. And it's a lot of it driven by, this is our pay philosophy, like, this is the number. We are all signing up to be paid in this range. So it's kind of like a join the group or don't,
Yeah.
And I think it goes a little bit to what you're saying before, right? It's not so much the market data all the time, but it's like finding the thing that we all as a group agree on is our identity when it comes to comp, and keeping it.
And I think, sometimes like the difference, like if you have a higher market position, like sometimes that delta between P50 and P90 is not that crazy, right? So people say, well, top of market. It's like, well, it's not, I don't know, maybe 15, 20% more than the middle of the market, like that's probably, for a lot of people isn't necessarily going to change, like, I'm going to quit everything and go join this company, right? Like, I think it's obviously a personal kind of thing, but
Yeah.
one other thing is like, I think people sometimes will get their pay information about like what's in the headlines. And I think what managers struggle sometimes with is like, it made it as a headline because it was an outlier, right? Because it was newsworthy to be in a headline. If it was what everybody else was doing, it's not newsworthy, So if you see this, like, 22-year-old software engineer turns down $1 million package for Google or whatever, right? It's like,
Yeah.
only Google's doing that, like, the local, like, Omaha based, tech company is probably not able to do something like that. So I think it's about setting expectations, being really clear about the process you're trying to set, and just know, like, you're not going to get it right all the time, but I think you can get it wrong less of the time, if that makes sense, right? Like, there's like, this is, I think, honestly, if you do comp and you're on this call, like, to some extent, we all chose our field poorly, right? Like, I mean, we have set ourselves up for like this is not an easy field to be in, and you have to have thick skin.
Oh no, I always joke, I'm one of the crazy ones because lasting more than a couple years, I feel like it's
Yeah.
a real accomplishment. We're all in some sort of badge group there.
And it's always like, how did you get into this field? And like, I've never heard somebody say I got into it on purpose. It's always like, I was in finance, but I'm good with people, or I was in HR and I'm good with numbers, right? Like, there's always some permutation of that. And it's like, I still want to meet the person who got into comp on purpose. I just have never come across it, but it's always like my first question when I interview somebody, like, just, why are you here? What are you doing? Like, because I maybe I'm trying to find my own reason for it. I don't know, but it's an interesting field.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is. And even some of these questions that are coming up, I feel like I could talk for hours about, because,
Yeah.
reading about the defiance of comp data and then different things about cost of labor and cost of living. A lot of this, I think, it really does come back to transparency. Something that was the first thing that when running a program I would get asked on is like, what are the ranges? Like, managers always want to have the numbers in hand, and it's not always relevant. I'd be like, I don't know, like, we can give up to your level, and it was hard, it'd be complicated to manage multiple spreadsheets. It was actually the first feature we built with Pequity. I was like, here's ranges that you can set
Yeah.
to any crazy granular level and run with it. But that access, I think, is what sometimes, if we deny it of them, even if we were to share one role and it was exactly the role that they needed for the offer, the fact that we held back the other,
Sure.
7 or 8
Yeah.
range level,
Yeah.
they're like, oh, they're hiding something. And
Yeah, absolutely. People are going to fill that vacuum with something, right? And like, I think the companies that have tried to go like full tilt the other way. Hey, Kaitlyn, are you there? The thing froze up. Just want to make sure I'm still on.
Oh, yep, you're still on.
Still says it's recording. I wonder, can someone put in the chat? Just okay, I think it's caught back up. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, I can hear
Awesome.
you.
All right, cool. Okay. So I think people are going to like fill the gap with whatever you don't give them, and I think that's it's only natural, right? But like, that doesn't necessarily mean that you take, I think comp people always like to say, well, I don't think we're ready to be like what Buffer, the software company, does, right? It's like, everybody's pay is fully transparent, here's all the ranges, and like, more power to them, right? I think, I would love to, I don't know anybody on that team who would love to just talk their ear off. I think, most companies are going to be somewhere in the middle. I think, at their most transparent, in the sense that, they want to feel like they can still differentiate pay on performance, or for a unique talent, or whatever it is, so because of that, they're going to make that trade-off where they're not, like, they're going to absorb some of that noise or some of that friction for the ability to do some of those different levers, and honestly keep a little bit of it hidden away. So, I think there's also research that basically says, like, people don't always like pay transparency. I think it depends where you shake out. Like, if you find out that you're paid more than the other people, you're pretty happy. But if you find out you're paid less than other people, like, you're not. And there's a chapter in the book where it talks about, like, in Norway, all tax records are public, right? Like, you can go in, you can search anybody's income if you want to. And for a while, like, people were building integrations into like Facebook and stuff, so you could like have a ranking of all your friends' official salaries. And so, like, they shut that stuff down over time. But it's like, it's interesting what people want to see, but like, even then, it doesn't fully close wage gaps. It doesn't do all of that. Like, so pay transparency is critically important, but we can't view that as the end all be all to solving all comp problems everywhere. So it'll just create, it will be important, but it will create kind of new kinds of problems also.
It will. And I mean, it's funny segueing into like companies and places that have published all this stuff. GitLab, I know for a while had a public calc there that they just took
Mhm.
down. We've had
Yeah.
a bunch of our customers come to us like, oh my gosh, can you recreate it for me? Because they were using it to get by with their geo adjustments. They were using the
Mhm.
calculation to figure out what I should pay in different areas. And so one of the top questions that's been voted up here is from Katherine Johnson on, I'm interested in your thoughts on adjusting pay based on where someone lives. How do we account for differences in cost of living when striving to have equitable pay?
That is such a uh, it's such a tough question, and I think a lot of it is going to depend on where where the business is starting from. If you're like a San Francisco based or Seattle based company and people are more remote, like, and you had already built into your cost structure that everybody was going to be there, and now they're more remote, like it doesn't really, not really hurting you to just allow them to keep the same ranges. But like if you've got one office in Nashville and one in, New York or whatever, like, most of us, we would say, okay, let me pull down the national data and I'm going to open the New York office. I'm going to just slap on a percent differential on top of it and call it a day and keep them separate. So like you can continue to do that. If people are remote, I think then you get into all these interesting questions around, okay, so did the person volunteer to go, or are we asking them to go? Like if you've asked that person to go to a specific location, then I think you do need to make sure that, their pay is adjusted, whatever it is. If they have volunteered to go, I think what some companies will probably do is say, listen, we're not going to get into your lifestyle choices. What we're going to do is we're going to have one geographic differential that we're going to use for all remote work. And you can have this deal with the consequences up or down, whatever that may be. Now, the challenge is when you have too many people, and like, let's say some of them are happen to choose New York, but they're on a lower geo differential than everybody else who has to be there. And now you've got some, on paper, you've got some pay equity issues, right? So how do you keep track of all of that? And
Yeah.
I think the end result of this just has to be companies going to get a lot simpler with their geographic differentials. And I honestly wonder, like, does that kind of harmonize the top and bottom to something a bit more normal? Because I think in some of these, my daughter again, in some of these, some of these locations, like I think it was more artificial than anything else. It's like, well, we have to put on, San Francisco is getting insane. Let's go put 30% on to the national or whatever. I'm not sure that's necessarily going to be the case anymore, but maybe I'll be wrong and the Bay Area will come roaring back. I don't know.
I mean, if it's helpful, with customers that we've talked to or consulting clients or anyone who've kind of come about, it seems like it's really driven, like you said, do you have a hub? Are you going to call people back to that hub? We know from our chat that we had with Frank Wagner at Google back in the fall, their plan was to stay on the geo differential process, and they thought it would be equitable. They use comp ratios and how closely you're paid to your midpoint to determine this equitability, which does take a lot of process, right? You have to have a good system in place and a good team to do the analysis to make sure that all that is true. And what we have seen for a lot of these companies who are going truly fully remote, their mindset so far has been they interestingly chose the most expensive metro in each
Yep.
state. And that's what they use as the differential for the entire state, because the difficulty I was having with one of our companies who works multinational in every state before the pandemic, they had the question with people who were coming in and saying, oh, I'm living in New York.
Yeah.
And like,
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Are they really, or are they, they showing up there once a quarter for whatever tax reasons? Not,
oh yeah. And
but
so,
like, then internationally, this gets more like,
yep.
I think there is more ability to really start with the market data internationally, because like you could say, like, if you're in France, for example, like you could say, well, if you're gonna live in, Paris versus, Toulouse or whatever, right? And it's like, well, where did the market data come from in the first place? Like, is Paris already priced in because almost every participant is a Paris-based person, and then maybe the differential goes the other way, not as something, above it. So I think you have to have that kind of two-step process to say, where is this data coming from? Do I need, or I guess multi-step process, do I need to go above or beyond? And like, how do I actually manage that? The administration of it is just really complex. And that's where I think being really clear about processes, having very simple rules, and then, allowing people to have their, reap the benefits or consequences of their own actions, I think is important sometimes too. I think we have to be willing to say no sometimes in order to preserve the overall system. I think a lot of us just have to get used to saying no, because one exception here might not be made over there, and then you've got a problem.
Couldn't agree more, which hopefully helps with The question that we just had on the geo adjustments there. Um, the next most top voted question, which hopefully won't take away too much, is David, do you have a favorite pair of Nike kicks?
Oh, okay, okay. All right, that's a good one. I would say, and this is a Nike question I'm happy to answer on the call. I will say the Internationalist is like a criminally underrated shoe. And you don't hear about it very much, but it's in the catalog. And they never ask me about shoe design, if you can believe it. But
Oh,
if you could bring up the Internationalist more, that'd be fantastic. I will say I have two pairs of Jordans, but they're like perfectly calibrated to like my coolness, credibility to wear Jordans. Like, one of them is like a pair of Jordan 8s, which are like super mid-tier sneakerhead Jordans. Like, they're not very cool, right? But I had them when I was a kid, so I wanted them again. And then I've got Jordan 1s, which are like the indisputably best Jordan, like unquestioned best Jordan, but they're mids, which is like super lame, like at least in the sneakerhead community, it definitely goes, the highs and the lows and the mids are like way down here, kind of on the coolness factor, right? So I'm not ready for like the cool Jordans yet, but again, the
working
internet.
your way up there.
What's that?
Working your way up there, I suppose.
I do, yeah. But like I'm usually wearing a Cortez or Internationalist. Those are my two favorites. Maybe some Blazers.
I love that. All right, so the next question that just shot up the list here is from Zach. So it's any tips on coming up with ranges for private startup company equity to be considered region? And he said that for market data, we use revenue, headcount, market valuation. Should it be on where you are going or where you are today?
Oh, well, and Kaitlyn, you probably have more insight into this than I do, to be honest. I think, like the general question of equity by region, and I'm wondering if that's region within the US or region internationally. I think like kind of the general, way of operating sometimes is to say, there are, different tiers of countries, right? So like, a grant in the US might be more competitive, but if you give that same dollar amount in the US, like, that's like 3x their salary, right? If they're in Vietnam or whatever. So, Kaitlyn, what do you think? I'm gonna pitch this. I will say I've mostly worked for like huge established companies, so the startup environment is not something that I will attempt to guess my way through.
I mean, we have been through a couple startups and helped consult with many. It's going to really come down to your philosophy, I feel like, on how you see equity. I've worked with companies where they say every region, even international, gets the same range. And the idea is that equity is based on potential. And how can you measure, like, potential isn't derivative of a location. It's not something that changes based on where you work. It truly is just the company and what it provides. However, I've also seen very algorithmic processes where they say, actually, we think that pay should be an equal cut of salary and equity. So that means that as we choose different regions, that value will drop. And I've also seen really market-driven companies where, and I've worked with them, where they say, well, when we look at the market data, equity is not a top factor. What actually matters more in some countries is bonuses or having different benefits in kind and things like that. So they'll lower the equity amount to go around it. There's no right or wrong. I would say to Zach that, using revenue, headcount, market valuation, all are great. I like to talk with companies if they're hiring quickly and stack them a little bit ahead of where you're at, because one, equity will be always lower the further up market you go. You're offering less equity and usually balancing out for cash. And two, I usually think if you're going that direction, you're trying to unlock talent at that level. So you want to pull comps that are closer to that unlock level versus down, because you're going to offer less base if you pull at a lower end, which might prevent you from getting, the great hire from Nike or Amazon, who's used to certain cash flows. So sounds like you're on the right path. If you have more questions, Zach, feel free to reach out. It's definitely something that we have expertise in. The next question that we have, and I know we have about 10 minutes, I'm going to see what we can get through here. Fair pay when it comes to employees with seniority versus new hires. Any thoughts?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think I still feel like too many companies do is to cap your percentage base increase when you get a promotion. Like, to me, you're just asking for people to fall behind over time when you do that. It's like, if you've said this person can do this job and they're rapidly going through the ranks or whatever, like pay them the market rate at time of promotion or at time of hire. Because there is a whole section in the book where it talks about like when our processes fail, like our traditional comp processes. Like, and this is one of those things that like if the market's moving a lot, you need to inject a different kind of talent, whatever it may be. Like, you need to make sure that people that are there and contributing and know your internal systems are keeping pace with it. And I think oftentimes that's, for like real governance reasons, we put these policies in place, but like we need to make sure that like we're not actually hindering the people that are existing in our sphere, right? Because I think that's always a challenge of, I'm contributing just the same as this person, plus I've been here a long time, but I'm, at whatever 90% of my range, this next person is at 120% because they're new and you just added a percent onto their old pay, of their previous company pay. And like, that's not, you have to have the right policies that can control for those kinds of things.
Couldn't agree more. My thought is you should price a job, right? And like there should be a range in that, and the performance can dictate where they fall in range, but the job has a price.
Yep.
So that's how I feel about the seniority of new hires. But there is another question here. So what is your point of view on offer or other types of pay negotiations? We have a couple of negotiation questions in here from the company side.
Yeah.
So if the prime company has embraced a comp philosophy, should the squeak wheel get the wheel? And I also see one at the bottom here, the whole no negotiation at offer stage strategy.
Yeah. If I had to choose, I'd say the no negotiation versus the squeaky wheel. I think the squeaky wheel is not a good thing to honor. I think that can be like, granted, like we've all been there, right? Where somebody's so squeaky and like, oh, they actually have a point. We need to go fix this, right? But like sometimes you will enable that behavior from the same managers. Like 6 months ago, it's like, wait a minute, aren't you the manager? Aren't you supposed to be taking care of their pay? Does that mean as a company you have processes to where like pay is maybe too controlled? We're not allowing managers to make the decisions in real time that they need to. That's a super tough balance to get the governance right versus the the budgetary stuff versus the actual decisions around comp. But I think remind me the first part of the question, because I think I've just looped myself here.
Oh no, it's good. So on offer negotiations. So
oh yeah, yep. Yeah. Okay. Negotiations, I feel like I always want to get to a point, I don't know if we'll ever get to this, where like we start treating negotiations in the same way that as comp pros we go into it. Like if I'm talking to somebody who I want to hire for my team or whatever, and then inevitably they'll say, okay, tell me what the job really is. And you'd be like, I'll make this up, I'm not sharing Nike stuff here, but we're a P60 company and this is a P3 job. Okay, I'm a comp person, I know what that number is now, right? Like, and then now we can start talking about more interesting things around the kind of work you can be doing here, what your career development opportunities look like, what the team is like, what the environment is like. I've kind of taken pay off the table because we're not hiding anything anymore. We're both looking at the same set of numbers. And I think that's like, to me, that's where we need to get to. No, not that everyone's going to have access to all the same data sets, or they're not necessarily going to understand all the ways in which your ranges are developed and all of that. But I think we can narrow that gap a little bit, right? Like if you are, we should be able to get in within a reasonable range where comp isn't really a surprise anymore, which will lower the need to negotiate over time. There's always going to be that, well, this person had a massive stock grant, we've got to pay for it, we've got to solve their walk away. That stuff's not going away, right? Like, but I think on base pay in particular, there's a lot of opportunity to try and close down that awkwardness gap, and that's on us to try and help people understand. And so I'm supportive of these kind of no negotiation or like very tightly controlled and governed renegotiation processes. Like I think there's this there's that like I think there's this idea that women ask less than men. The reasons that I've seen, that women do ask just as much as men, or at least it's within a few percentage points. But like men get the yes more than women do. But like that upper number is like 20%. Men are only winning pay negotiations against their company like 1 out of 5 times. So it's like if your entire comp strategy is that, like you're like, that's not putting anybody in a good spot. And I've always struggled with this idea that, hey, we really want you to join our company. The first thing we're going to do is get in a fight with you. Like that's not like about something so deeply personal as pay. Like there's always going to be that healthy tension between talent acquisition and comp, because if there's not, you're probably paying too much, to be honest. If they're just kind of consider everything. But like we have to get on the same page with some of this stuff. We shouldn't be trying to set up, adversarial relationships with our new hires when they're coming in.
No, I couldn't agree more. I always say, like, don't have the manager negotiate, right? Like, let them talk to me, but don't, if they want to be mad, like, don't do it with the manager. I really have about 6 more minutes. So, the top question that kind of came up here, and I'm sure your book touches on many of the current, what you've seen and historically how you've handled, and some suggestions. But this question gets a bit more to, in addition to traditional annual merit and cycle and promotion budget, what other trends or currents are you seeing in the market to maintain competitive pay?
To maintain competitive pay, I think is kind of loaded. And I go into this question where I'm not really sure there's much difference between one company or the other. And so I go into this kind of, I steer into this route that I think will probably be somewhat controversial in the sense that if we're all looking at the same data on the same timelines, on the same whatever, like it's only like viewed as not competitive with one another when because of that black box nature of it, you know. So I think there's this idea that there's like this super free flowing free market for pay and for talent. I'm not sure that there is, you know, and I think that's a real problem for us. So and I think it's especially true on the low end of the wage scale. Trends, I guess I might take a bit of a different route on this. I think the trend, like, I think there are maybe two schools of thought out there. And I think one of them is, how do we design the right technology systems to tell me how to pay the exact dollar amount of what this person should be making at this time? You know, how do we optimize for the number? I think the companies that are going to win in the future are the companies that get the number credible and right. They can't be way off, but optimize for experience and for perception too.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, I think many people would rather work for a company where they make whatever 98,000, but they know the process was fair and that everything that like you've got, the company has your back and like they're doing these things in the right way and the people around you are paid equitably, then where you make 100,000 because it's the optimized number, but you're like kind of sharky against people. You're always wondering kind of, am I paid? Like, I just think one of those employment experiences is dramatically better than the other.
Yeah.
So I worry that there's too much focus on our field about how do we steer the right machine learning algorithm to get to the exact number. I just don't think that's super meaningful. You know, like that might help drive specific behaviors over time, but I think that's one of the things that I do appreciate about Pequity's approach. Like, how do we preempt some of that stuff, and how do we help people make better decisions about comp, not necessarily drive the ship into like this exact number, because that's, again, as we know, people get used to their new number immediately, right? Like,
Oh yeah.
pay raise, they're super thrilled about it, and next week they're mad about, you know, somebody, you know, didn't clean the microwave in the break room, whatever, right? Whatever it is, right? So it's maybe that's not relevant anymore because we don't work in offices, but like, again, pay is only going to get you so far. Like that, you have to optimize for that experience and that process piece too.
Couldn't agree. Yeah, our process is very non-formulaic. We let you put the configurations in place because of this. Like, I think if I tried to hand a formula to people, they'd pick it apart and say it doesn't work for me, because why would it? You know, the assumptions that are underlying it could be completely off from your industry or your talent, and that's, you're going to toss it out and tell me I'm not worth my salt and comp, which would be very devastating after 10 years. Definitely not the direction we want to go.
There's always more, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and so, you know, we have 3 minutes left, so I want to make sure to give a quick plug on your book. You know, you just wrote it. When is it going to be available, and how can people order it?
It is available on June 29th. You can order it wherever you like to buy books. I mean, it's at all the usual places: Amazon, Walmart, Target, your local bookstore for sure. I live in Portland, so naturally I will be going to Powell's on the day of, but should be available everywhere. And it working on some foreign rights deals, and I almost said it out loud, but I shouldn't, because it's not final yet. So eventually there'll be some other languages too, but not anytime soon.
Oh, well, congrats. I mean, thank you so much, David, for joining us today. And thank you for everyone who's on the call. Again, we'll send out a recording of this. If you have any additional questions that you want to ask David, feel free to send them in. We can always send that over to him, and he can get back as he has time. He's very busy. He's in his comp cycle right now, so we'll have to give him some space for that. But any parting thoughts or words, David, before we sign off?
No, I'm just glad I didn't have to answer this question about Argentina, because I don't know that, like, this inflation is so high there. We're struggling with that as well. Again, let me just say thank you so much, y'all. Again, if you want to talk Nike comp stuff, just reach out to me. That's fine. If you want to talk about the book, let me know where you disagreed, where you agreed. Thank you so much for your time. This has been a real pleasure, and looking forward to hopefully meeting some of you in person one day.
Yeah, Powell Books, the 29th. You guys can ask him live.
Yeah. I'll just be walking around. It seems to really fix it up, I guess. Yeah.
Well, we pre-ordered it. I'm excited to have it in hand, and definitely will be using some of the lessons. Loved your thoughts, loved the conversation, and thank you everyone who joined today again. We'll definitely be in touch with posting this, but thank you, David. We'll be in touch soon.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.